Dear listeners, welcome to the Eco Lecture series on Green Solution for a Resilient Future. It is presented to you in the framework of the Green Climate Action Month, which comprises inspiring online events on environment and climate topics and is organized by the Committee for Environmental Protection under the Government of the Republic of Tajikistan and GIZ, Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit. The climate is changing and it affects us all. Tajikistan will, for example, experience higher temperature, more frequent mud flows, floods and droughts. Tajikistan is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the Europe and Central Asia region and has relatively low capacity to adapt to the changes. With capacity here, we mean, for example, social and technical skills or strategies of individuals, groups or institutions to respond quickly and effectively to the changing climate. However, Tajikistan is rich in nature and natural resources, which can play a key role in the required response and adaptation to climate change. In this lecture here and today, we want to look into one approach or type of adaptation, which specifically builds on solution nature provides, also known as nature-based solutions. The approach is called ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, in short EBA. We want to understand what is EBA, looking at the four cornerstones and bringing examples from Tajikistan. We will also dive a bit into the application or method of EBA, the EBA steps, which have been developed based on one regional project implemented by GIZ and financed by the German Federal Ministry for Environment and implemented also in Tajikistan in the last years. In the last part of the lecture, we will provide some highlights from the project or lessons learned, at least some of them. By the way, this eco lecture is also in Russian, available online if you are interested. What is ecosystem-based adaptation? Actually, there is a long and rather complicated definition of EBA that was adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity in 2009. What is this convention? It is a treaty, international treaty on the conservation of the biological diversity or biodiversity and the sustainable use of species and ecosystems. And Tajikistan has signed this convention already in 1997, and that's why it is committed to its guidance and goals. For the lecture's purpose here, we will simply use the core of the EBA definition that says, ecosystem-based adaptation is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of an overall strategy to help people adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. Now we will take the definition apart and look into the four cornerstones, which are highlighted here in different colors. The first cornerstone, and very important one, is help people adapt to climate change, which results in enhanced resilience and decreased vulnerability of people. Resilience, what do we mean here? Resilience is the ability to respond, prepare or cope with changes, and EBA helps to increase this ability. And vulnerability of people? That refers to the degree to which they are, the people, sensitive or susceptible to the changes climate is imposing on them or even unable to cope with. So reducing this vulnerability and increasing the resilience of people, of us, are key ambitions and goals when talking about adapting to climate change. Sometimes EBA gets mixed up with, for example, ecosystem-centric adaptation or climate-smart conservation, which actually helps nature to adapt so that, for example, species like the snow leopard here or ecosystems, biodiversity can adapt with the changing climate. You might also hear this approach referred to as adaptation for ecosystems or adaptation of ecosystems. While many may call this approach ecosystem-based adaptation, in fact it is not. Because EBA, as we said, is focusing on the people, helping them to adapt to climate change in a way which does little or no harm to nature. And as just mentioned, the success is measured in terms of reduction of the vulnerability of people and the lack of damage to the environment. Having clarified this, we will move now to the second cornerstone of EBA, which is the adverse effects of climate change EBA is addressing, so the response to current and future impacts of climate change. In practice, this requires the consideration of climate change information in every single planning stage, you can say. Actually, that is a must-have for any development intervention, project or measure nowadays, in order to be longer lasting and not doing harm, for example. What does this mean? Here an example from Tajikistan. Looking at the projection of temperature change during the current century we live in, we see here 3 different developments of the annual average temperature, each highlighted in another color, depending on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, for example carbon dioxide, the world is emitting in the future. In worst case, the temperature can rise up to 5 degrees until 2080, if we and the world don't manage to reduce greenhouse gas emissions tremendously, which is reflected in the red line in the graph. If we manage to reduce them, taking global actions and live more sustainable, the temperature rise can be below 2 degrees. See the blue line here. The yellow line represents a development between the 2 scenarios. Another relevant parameter or climate signal to look at is precipitation, which includes rain and snow. However, in contrast to projected temperature, future trends for precipitation are rather more uncertain. To simplify it here a bit, we look at the current century again and pick the projections of winter precipitation change only, which is based again on different emission scenarios, represented here again in red, yellow and blue. We can see that there is an overall upward trend in winter precipitation for all scenarios. However, that doesn't mean, for example, that more snow will fall. Actually, the opposite. It will be more rain, because due to the increasing temperature. And this, for an example, will affect water storage capacity for the irrigation season in the country and others. Unfortunately, there is a lot of uncertainty of how the climate will change, but what we know already is that it is changing, and therefore such climate information need to be taken into account during planning. Having talked about cornerstone 1 and 2, we will move now to the third one, which is using biodiversity and ecosystem services. What do we mean with biodiversity and ecosystem services here? Biodiversity is the variety and variability of animals, plants and microorganisms nature and ecosystem provides. And ecosystem services are concrete benefits of nature, of ecosystems, which are provided to the human, to us. They can be divided in different categories. For example, we have regulating services like erosion prevention or retention of floods, the nature can assist us with. And they are provisioning services. We all know them, like crops, like food, raw material, wood, also pasture are included here, and many others. And another category is supporting services. For example, habitats for species, for animals. And another interesting one is cultural service, for example, the opportunity for recreation, for tourism. Now let's have a look at a concrete example from Tajikistan for using biodiversity and ecosystem service to adapt to changing climate. Here we have the afforestation and restoration of forest areas, which can prevent soil erosion, which is caused by floods and mud flows and which are likely to increase in the future. Another examples are pastures. Improved pastures and their management can prevent decreasing productivity of land. And considering a high risk of heat stress, for example, or late frost events in the next decades, this will become or is already quite important for the country as well. A third and interesting example here is also the conservation of pollinators' habitats to prevent deterioration of overall ecosystem production, not only for securing the honey production in the country and worldwide, because we know already wild bees are already declining due to the global warming, but also other species in their habitat for the pollination of plants are at risk. So last but not least, we want to come now to the fourth cornerstone, which is putting attention on the aspect of EBA as part of an overall strategy. That it is not a standalone intervention, first of all, and it generates other societal benefits that contributes to sustainable development. Once more, let's have a look of one example from Tajikistan to better understand what we mean by that. You can see here a river or a stream, which is used, for example, for irrigation purposes. It is a pure ecosystem service which is available. Combined with a system of drip irrigation here, water can be used more efficiently, especially when temperature and evaporation are increasing in the future. We are referring here to use diverse approaches and maintain many options for adapting to changing conditions. Further, in many parts of the country, engineering solutions like heavier engineering solutions are required, like water pipes which bring water from the upstream part of a river to the fields and meadows, something which doesn't really harm the environment, of course, if properly installed. We can call this also ecosystem-friendly adaptation approach. And combined, or in combination with pipes and canals, which can be found, better use of river and streams for irrigation purpose are possible. And this is a rather than holistic adaptation approach that will help increase water security, as we heard also, as precipitation becomes less reliable. EBA was never meant to be the solution for everything. Sometimes you cannot count only on nature. We know. That is why EBA should be considered as part of an overall strategy, adaptation strategy, and works best when it's combined with other approaches. Maybe let's give you also an example here of a combined approach from the field of disaster risk reduction, which is quite common in the country. For example, here the construction of gabions, a grey infrastructure, pure. And in connection with afforestation behind, it stabilizes the riverbank even more effectively and prevents flooding or also mud flows in the long run. So this combination makes it even more effectively. Moving now to another important point, because besides that, EBA measures are also recognized to be cost effective and able to generate multiple benefits like socially, economically, health-wise, and contributing to the conservation of biodiversity. Here we come back to our example of afforestation. We already talked about erosion prevention, but planting and restoring a forest area can also generate income, for example, from timber or fuelwood, or non-timber forest products like sea buckthorn, mushrooms, dog rose, or pistachios. There are also other public benefits like increased soil fertility if you have an intact forest in place. So, to summarize what we have just heard, there is actually an easy way to determine if something is ecosystem-based adaptation or not. First of all, the motivation for EBA must be to help people. We said that. Second, all adaptation, including EBA, must reduce vulnerabilities to changes in climate and the effects of those changes, so climate change. And the third one, EBA must use nature to help people reduce their vulnerabilities. Ecosystem-based adaptation requires all three of these components. And if any are missing, we cannot consider a strategy as ecosystem-based adaptation. Now we want to have a look into the application of EBA, the different steps from planning to implementation and learning from EBA interventions, the EBA steps. The regional EBA project of GIZ, with focus on high mountainous regions in Central Asia, implemented 2015 until 2020 in cooperation with the Committee for Environmental Protection under the government of the Republic of Tajikistan, developed a method to be applied in a participatory way. The method is based on the Conservation Measures Partnership's open standards, the leading adaptive management framework in the field of biodiversity conservation and sustainable ecosystem management. The conservation standards, they provide a user-friendly, evidence-based and consistent approach that, when applied to EBA, can help to identify priority ecosystems, can assess climate and non-climate related threats, and determine the most appropriate interventions or measures. The main beneficiaries of the conservation standards-based EBA method are rural communities. These communities benefit from the method not only because it supports adaptation planning and practice, but also through increased understanding and awareness of climate change, which comes along with it. And secondary beneficiaries are regional and national policymakers, as well as development and biodiversity conservation communities or the research community. EBA in general and this method emphasizes the participation of communities. and the use of their traditional and local knowledge system, which is very important for adaptation. The method itself consists of 5 essential steps, which include 13 sub-steps. Here, for now, we just have a look at 5, from assessing to planning the intervention, implementing selected measures, analyzing and adapting them, to sharing the results and lessons learned, if possible, really with other communities and projects. We keep it here really short. If you are interested to understand, dive deeper and understand more in detail, we have at the end of the presentation also the guidance, or a link to the guidance. In the last part of our presentation, we want to discuss some lessons learned in general and specifically from the regional GIZ project. And here, very important, and therefore, attention please, adaptation to climate change, that is a constant ongoing process. It is not a project with a limited period of time, as climate is constantly changing as well. So it is a just approach, or the planning and implementation. So adaptation to climate change and EBA is really profiting from learning and adjustments throughout. The consideration of climate information, as mentioned earlier, is key, as well as the respective modification of the planning and implementation of measures. Moreover, in order to increase adaptive capacities in the mid and long term, local results and experiences of adaptation and EBA also need to be mainstream or integrated into local, for example, village development plans, but also, and very important, in other regional and national development planning. Why? Well, to avoid opposing goals and methods and achieve a greater impact at the end. Another topic we already talked about is the uncertainty climate change inherits. But how to practically deal with it when planning or adjusting our measures at the local level with the community. We want to present you here one method or exercise we applied in the project. It is called scenario planning. This tool is especially helpful when you encounter a situation with high level of uncertainty or low level of control, which totally applies to the predicting the future climate and finding out how to adapt to it. Basically, it takes access of possible changes. So, for example, having the case that precipitation gets less or more based on the output range of the different climate scenarios available. This range is one axis, here shown in the x-axis. Another one in the y-axis here is the temperature, which can be here, for example, slightly or really warmer. When the temperature becomes really warm, if that is predicted, and the amount of precipitation increases simultaneously, it increases, for example, soil erosion. See here in the upper right corner. In another case, when the temperature becomes a little warmer, but the amount of precipitation decreases, as we don't know 100%, it leads to the transformation, for example, from forests to grasslands, which is reflected here in the bottom right corner. Thus, considering these scenarios help prepare for different uncertainties which are associated with the climate change in the future. So this tool can help to plan in a more flexible manner, which is very often required. So, if you have caught your interest and you want to dive deeper into EBA, please have a look. Here we have the guidance I mentioned already on conservation standards. It is available in English and very soon already in Russian as well. A policy brief we have on mainstreaming EBA in policy planning. It is available in English and Russian, as well as a brief on integrating climate information, climate risk information. It is available in English and Russian. And all three you can find on our website here. So before we close, let us recall the main key messages we heard here today. We said ecosystem-based adaptation is a nature-based solution that makes use of biodiversity and ecosystem services to build resilience and reduce vulnerability of people to climate change. And we discussed here or covered the 4 cornerstones of the definition. We talked about that EBA has multiple benefits. Remember the afforestation example here. We highlighted the importance of integrating climate information, as it is key for any EBA and adaptation project, actually for any development project, to plan effectively and take due account of forthcoming changes. One tool was presented to you, the scenario planning, which helps to deal with the uncertainty of climate change. And very important, and not to forget, EBA or adaptation in general is a constant ongoing process, such as climate change as well. And last but not least, we highlighted the participation of community. It plays an important role in the different steps of the EBA realization in order to address properly their needs and making use of their knowledge. We thank you very much for your attention. We hope you enjoyed this introduction to our work. Information on other activities on environment and climate by the Committee for Environmental Protection under the Government of the Republic of Tajikistan can be found on the website touchnature.tg, and additional information on biodiversity on the website of the National Biodiversity and Biosafety Center, biodiv.tg. If you are interested in learning more about sustainable land management in Tajikistan and how to promote different concepts, please visit our eco-lecture on integrative land use management, online in English and Russian as well, or follow this link to the publication of the respective framework concept. Please feel free to contact us for any questions or exchange. We are happy to hear from you. Till then, all the best, and stay tuned on other activities during the Green Climate Action Month via the Facebook page of the Committee for Environmental Protection.